All right, before we start, I'm going to show you all a little quick intro video here. Just something we've been doing, something working on. Hopefully the volume will work. If you have a volume issue, let me know, Julie.
Thanks for joining us today. I'm Craig Fowler. I am the Vice President of Quality Assurance and Training here at CNC. We're excited to tell you about some exciting frontline development.
Screen is paused. Can you see that?
Yes, sir.
So my screen sharing is
I can hear
paused.
it too.
Okay.
We're continuing to grow at a phenomenal rate, and we want to make sure everyone who works with us has an opportunity to grow with us. And if you're interested in joining our team, now is the perfect time. As we look toward the tropics and prepare for hurricane season, are you ready? We'd like you to meet David James and Todd Eisenberg, our latest additions to the CNC training department, who have been working hard to enhance our training programs and career development courses. As we rapidly grow, our clients are beginning to require Xactimate X1 Level 2 certified adjusters to handle their assignments. With David handling our property training and Todd our flood training, we're providing as many opportunities as possible now to receive your Level 2 X1 certification and to be storm ready.
We've got Xactimate Level 1, Level 2. We've got Claim Experience. We have Xactimate mobile app. And we're also just building the future for an Xactimate contents class and Exact analysis class.
We also include on our Symbility estimating training classes, which can be, again, found at adjustingexpectations.com.
The more proficient you are at writing estimates, the easier the claims process is going to be for you, the client, and the policy.
With a combined 60 years of adjusting and training experience, CNC's training department is helping you to build your future.
All of this experience is being developed into CNC Pro, our new e-learning platform, so you can learn on your own.
Coming soon, you're going to have access to our instructor-led classes and virtual classes,
Including our flood news at noon.
so forward your career, fine-tune your adjuster skills, add to your toolbox.
Thank you for your time and being a part of the CNC family. We hope to see you soon. Stay updated with everything CNC by following us on Facebook or LinkedIn.
Okay, so that's just a little intro, just real quick to give you all. So anyway, good morning, good afternoon, or really even good evening to everyone out there. And some of y'all are joining us from the UK. I am your host, Craig Fowler, and welcome to CNC's Flood News at Noon. Joining me today is my co-host, who often fills in for me, the host seater, the social greeter, the bio reader. That's Miss Julie Ward. She, I think she just she turned off the camera, probably to avoid that conversation. There she is. So, but before we get started with this episode today, I want to thank our clients and expert presenters who have been on our Flood News at Noon for the last 10, 11, 12, 13 episodes. You all really make CNC's Flood News at Noon a great success. And for being a part of our second season, we have a little token of our appreciation. We have a little CNC swag with some, some mobile flair that we're sending your way. And another special part of being on, we're going to invite you back for season 3. So we had some great episodes. We had some great episodes that were presented, and we have another great episode today. Like all our past episodes, you can find those on our CNC YouTube channel. Just as we're recording this episode as well, you can find this episode later on our CNC YouTube channel as well. But joining us today is CNC's very own Dr. Hal Needham, or Hurricane Hal, flood scientist, man of mystery, always on the move, researching and reporting, always out doing something unique, something exciting, something just, it amazes me the things that he does and comes up with. So Hal's been on with us before. So today we're just going to skip his bio. We're not going to actually read his bio or have the intro formalities or anything like that. We know he's a flood scientist. We know he's involved in some great flood projects out there. But let's get right into this presentation today, because really when you see a title like Don't Get Blindsided Buffet, it's got to be good. It's got to be exciting. It's got to be entertaining. I mean, and if you can't get excited just to listen to that title, then you need to check your pulse. So Hal, again, thanks for joining us today. It's always a pleasure having you on. welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Julie. So excited to be here today on Flood News at Noon. I'm just sharing my screen here. I'm just going to maximize this and we're going to hop right into it. But yeah, I'm a big fan of buffets myself. So I kind of like this title. I'm just going to try to move this around. How do I minimize this so I can still have the top of the screen? I think, hang on one second. Maybe I can just drag this. There we go. Okay, we're all set. So a perspective on floods from the Don't Get Blindsided buffet. I love buffets because it's a little sampling of everything, and that's what we're going to do today here on Flood News at Noon. So let's hop into it. I live in Galveston, Texas. We're a coastal community here on the Texas coast, about 60 miles southeast or 100 kilometers southeast of Houston. We're right there on the coast. And I want to start with a little story. About 2 years ago, I had to leave my home here. I live in the red circle there on the east end of Galveston Island, and I needed to go to Hobby Airport, one of Houston's two big airports. I needed to go up there to rent a car. So on a Friday evening, a friend of mine drove me up Interstate 45, and it took about 45 minutes to get from my home in Galveston to Houston's Hobby Airport to rent a car. And I drove this car around for the weekend. You know, I can't remember what car it was. I know it was not a Ford Mustang convertible because last month they upgraded me to a Ford Mustang convertible and it was amazing. And I loved it. It was great. 2 years ago, I don't know what I rented, but it was not a convertible. But just imagine I'm driving around the tropical island for the weekend, having a lot of fun with my friends. And then on Sunday evening, it was time to return the rental car from Galveston back to Houston Hobby Airport. Question I'm going to ask you, how long do you think I gave myself to get back from Galveston to the airport to return the rental car? Now, keep in mind, on Friday evening, that drive took 45 minutes. How long do you think I gave myself on Sunday evening? If you answered 45 minutes, you're right. And simple math, I just said, hey, if it took me 45 minutes on Friday, it should take me 45 minutes on Sunday. So I got out there onto Broadway Avenue in my town, and I encountered a scene like this. There was gridlock on Sunday evening, and I thought, man, what terrible luck. There must be an accident up ahead. So as we inched along after about 20 or 30 minutes of not moving much, I realized three things. Number one, there was no accident. Number two, I was now going to be running really late and possibly charged for an extra day of the rental car because I'm going to get the car back so late. And number three, and most importantly, I realized I was blindsided by a pattern that I did not expect. As I was sitting there in traffic, trying to think, why is traffic not moving? I remembered something. I remembered a Sunday evening in March of 2004, I was out by Lake Tahoe, California, coming back to Sacramento and San Francisco, and there was a ton of traffic coming from the cities back into, coming from Lake Tahoe back into the cities. And what I wrote up there on the top is playground traffic. So there's something called playground traffic where, you know, people in a big metro area go out to the mountains or the beach for the weekend, and on Sunday evening, they're all trying to get back into the city. I saw this as well in the Tampa-St. Pete area in April of 2014, people coming from Clearwater and St. Pete Beach back into Metro Tampa. And I saw this near New York City several times, people coming down from the Pocono Mountains on a Sunday evening back into the New York metro area. This is a pattern of playground traffic, and this is exactly what I encountered in Houston, Galveston. I got blindsided by this. I just thought Friday traffic's the same as Sunday. In a lot of places it is, or even less on Sunday, but near a playground of a metro area, it can be really more. This is something that completely blindsided me 2 years ago. And this taught me something about the world. You know, we have a perception of reality. And sometimes that perception of reality is not aligned with real world reality. Have you ever said something to someone and they got really offended and you were shocked because their worldview did not really match what you thought it would be? You know, there's a reason we need signs like this. Stop. GPS is wrong. Road ends here. We use maps and GPS as a representation of the real world, but sometimes they're not accurate, right? Sometimes we look out our windshield and what we're seeing on the ground is different than what we're seeing on the map. And so we're going to talk about that today. This is a struggle for all human beings. All of us, sometimes our perception of the world and the real world are not aligned. This is something all humans struggle with. It's one of the big struggles we have in life. And it shows up a lot in flood science and climate science. Have you ever gone out to a flood scene and maybe talked to someone who had their house flooded? And their perception is they were completely blindsided. They did not think that this was possible, but nonetheless it happened. So we're going to talk about a perspective on floods from the Don't Get Blindsided buffet. I'm Dr. Hal Needham, climate data and natural hazard scientist with Flood Information Systems and CNC. I'll share this contact information at the end as well, but I love doing education on climate science and flood science. I've been working in the climate space for about 15 years. I'm going to present 7 thoughts that are common thoughts that we may have when we live, especially in flood-prone and hurricane-prone areas, and really investigate how we can get blindsided with those thoughts. So let's hop to it. Thought number 1, we get a direct hurricane strike around every 25 years. This year is 17 years since Hurricane Ivan, so we're due for another hurricane strike in 8 more years. That seems to make sense, right? If you look at the averages, you say, how many more years until we're due for a hurricane? People use this language all the time in the coastal zone. This is an interesting graphic that I found in the library in Charleston, South Carolina. The x-axis here are years from the 1880s through 1990, and every bar you see there on the graphic is a tropical storm if it's hollow, or a hurricane if it's dark, that passed within 75 nautical miles of Hilton Head, South Carolina. And something really odd we see with this, in an 11-year period from 1888 to 1898, there were 8 hurricanes. 8 hurricanes in 11 years. And then over the next 50 years, from around 1899 to 1949, there was only 1 hurricane. 8 hurricanes in 11 years, followed by 1 hurricane in 50 years. What in the world is going on here? And this is what we see a lot in climate and flooding. A lot of times these storms tend to cluster, so they don't come as regularly as we might expect. Here's a U-Surge graphic. So this is a time series. This shows the flood history for Corpus Christi, Texas. This comes from U-Surge. Here at CNC, we run the global coastal flood database called U-Surge that gives us insights into a comprehensive flood history for coastal locations. This is time from 1900 to 2020 for Corpus Christi, Texas, the height of floods in feet. And you can see every dot on this graphic is a flood event. And what we see here between 1961 and 1980, over a 20-year period, there were 4 floods that exceeded 7 feet. So if your house is at 7 feet in Corpus Christi, you flooded 4 times in 20 years. But in the past 40 years, you haven't flooded at all. And so this is what we see sometimes. We see a lot more clustering in the climate record than we would expect. There's a game that you can play with a quarter. This is a fun party game. What you do is you get a quarter, you get 10 people in a room, and you have 10 people in a room. You tell one of the people to leave the room. Now you're left with 9 people in a room. And you have those 9 people make believe that they flipped a coin 50 times. And they just make up a fake sequence. They say, okay, the first one I'll say was heads. The second one was tails, maybe 2 heads, a tail. They just make it up. You have 9 people make up a sequence. And then on the 10th sheet of paper, so you write those down on papers, on the 10th sheet of paper, you actually flip a coin 50 times and you write down the real sequence. The person who left the room comes back in, and there's a trick for them to figure out which of those 10 sheets of paper was real and which 9 were fake. What's the trick? The trick, again, is that the fake sequences, people think you might get 2 heads or 2 tails in a row. But when you actually flip the coin, you might see something like this. Heads, tails, heads, heads, tails, 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 tails. People don't ever think you're going to get 5 tails in a row. But when you actually flip a coin, you'll see it happen. It's just human thinking. We think it's going to go back and forth more than it will. And so we tend just randomly. This is just flipping a quarter. You have a 50-50 shot. Do it this evening with your kids or grandkids at home, and you'll be shocked to find 8 heads in a row or something like that. You'd never think it was possible. This happens in the climate record all the time, that we get clusters of storms. So a more accurate thought to number 1, long-term data suggest we get a direct hurricane strike around every 25 years. This means we have a 4% chance of a strike every year. However, scientists are predicting a more active hurricane season than normal this year. So our risk is likely a little higher than 4% chance this year in 2021. That's a more accurate way to look at your chance of a hurricane strike. Every year is more or less the same, but some years are a little more likely than others based on some different climate conditions. Thought number 2, I'm not in the flood zone, so I don't need flood insurance. That's a common thing that we see. And again, this is a U-Surge time series of flood history. For Pensacola, Florida, we have high water marks for 55 hurricanes and tropical storms going back to 1880. We can see that there are 3 flood events that got to over 9 feet. And this is why we'd be shocked when we see that FEMA's base flood elevation for Pensacola, where they tell you need to build to be above the 100-year flood, is 7 feet. So if you build to that 100-year flood level, you would have flooded 3 times in the past 120 years. And so this is the FEMA map showing you how high you have to build in Pensacola, showing your base flood elevation right down there by the port. And so sometimes our flood histories don't seem to match that well with our flood guidance. Did you know 83% of homes flooded in Hurricane Harvey in 2017 did not have flood insurance? And again, a lot of people said, hey, I'm not in the flood zone. I'm not required to have flood insurance. I'm not going to flood because I'm not in the flood zone. So another maybe more accurate way to look at this, although I'm not in FEMA's flood zone, they often underestimate flood levels, and they actually do not use real world comprehensive data for their analysis. They use computer modeling. So I should add a buffer. Also, even if their maps were accurate, floods greater than the 100-year flood happen all the time in our large country. I should get flood insurance anyway. We have over 3,000 counties in the US, so we should expect on average, even if the flood maps were perfect, we should expect 3 counties every year on average to get a 1,000-year flood because our country is so huge. So that's a more accurate way to look at this. How about thought number 3? Another way that we can get blindsided is by saying, hey, since I have flood insurance, the contents of my home are probably covered. We were doing a project in Biloxi, Mississippi for the last 2 years where we're coming alongside the community, building out their flood history, building a map of all the building elevations. And it's just been a really exciting project. I got to know some people on the ground, and there was a guy named Kenny that I got to know and became friends with. And I always ask people 2 questions in a flood zone. Number 1, do you need anything? And number 2, what did you learn? What are lessons learned that we can share with others? And Kenny said, I wish I knew that I did not have flood insurance, or I did not have insurance coverage on my contents. I assumed that since I had flood insurance, my contents were covered. And he did not. When I asked him, what's the biggest lesson you could share with other people? That's what he said. And so we're often boots on the ground, getting into these communities, hearing people's stories so we can share them and help with education. A more accurate way to look at thought number 3, I should double check if the contents of my home are covered in my flood insurance policy. Again, it's all about not being blindsided if you do get flooded. We're going through these quickly. We only have 7 and we're already up to number 4. I have lived in my home for 40 years and it has never flooded. So I feel assured it will never flood. I would say this is the number 1 way that people get blindsided that I talk to. They say, hey, I've lived here for 20, 30, 40 years. We've never flooded, so we're not really worried about that. There's a great story that comes from my town here of Galveston. You know, we were destroyed by a hurricane on September 8th, 1900. It's still the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. A 16-foot saltwater storm surge was pushed across the island, destroyed much of the island. 8,000 people died here on the island. And there's a house here that we still have today called 1502 Market Street. Ida Smith Austin used to live there with her husband. And she has a really interesting insight that she shares after the storm. So the 1900 storm, September 8th, 1900, she has a journal entry here from November 6th, 1900, about 2 months after the great Galveston hurricane of 1900. She writes about her recollections of that day. And she said, I was busy about my domestic affairs. This is the day of the hurricane. Saturday, rearranging my house, when I heard a man who ran up the street exclaim, my God, the waters of the bay and the Gulf have met on 15th Street. I went on the gallery to realize that what he said was only too true. But I felt no uneasiness, and I remarked to my niece, we have nothing to fear. The water has never been over our place, and I just felt it could not come. In a few minutes, we heard the lapping of the salt water against the sidewalk, and then it slowly crept into the yard. Then she goes in to talk about the storm damage, and at the very bottom, she says, we opened all downstairs and let the water flow through. Soon it stood 3 feet in all the rooms. In the opening paragraph, she says, we're not going to flood. It's never come this high before. The next paragraph down, all of a sudden, there's 3 feet of water in the house. This is amazing. This is 121 years ago, and almost verbatim, these are the same issues that we hear people talk about today, where they say, hey, I've lived here for 20 years. I've never flooded. It's not a problem. But sometimes we're just not looking at the big enough picture. This is the time series for U-Surge flooding for Galveston. We have high water marks for 93 hurricanes and tropical storms, more than any city in the world. I want you to imagine that you moved to Galveston in 1920, you bought a house and you lived there for 40 years, from 1920 to 1960, and the elevation of your house was 9 feet. So everything in yellow there, it's bound by time on the left and right. So from 1920 to 1960, you were in this home. It's bound by elevation on the bottom. And we see 0 blue dots in this yellow square. It means in this 40-year period, you never flooded. But look what happens the next year. Hurricane Carla comes and puts 2 feet of water in your house. In human terms, 40 years is a lot of life, right? In terms of Mother Nature, it's just a blink. And so we need to really step out and look at these longer time scales. Even a couple decades isn't enough. We really should look at 100 years plus. And usually we're going to see some big events that have happened a long time ago that people may have forgotten, but are still relevant and that we can repeat today. So a more accurate way to look at thought number 4 and not be blindsided, although my home has not flooded in the 40 years that I've lived there, it still could flood one day because the greatest flood potential is probably much higher than the floods I've seen in my time there. Again, it's counterintuitive, and this is why we come into communities and build their flood history, because it's just hard to believe that something much worse than what you've ever seen could happen if you've lived in a place for 40 years. We're moving right along, fast pace here today. Thought number 5, building my home to the minimum required elevation and minimum required building codes will save me money. Well, that seems to make sense, right? Why not just go to the minimum requirement and that will be most cost effective? I don't know if you've heard of fortified before. It's a way to build better, and it's a big thing that's really taking off now. It's a way that you can really nail down the roof better. If you do lose a shingle, there are ways that you can seal up underneath your shingles so that you minimize the water damage if you do have minor roof damage. And you can also lock in the building so that it's really better secured and better prepared. This is a photograph from Hurricane Sally that struck South Alabama last year, and you can see a lot of these homes have tarps, but some of the homes do not have tarps on their roofs. And what we found in this picture is, you know, this house back here with the RV was actually a fortified house. So we see a lot of blue tarps in this neighborhood, but this house, for example, back here on the left, does not have a tarp because it had a fortified roof. It was built to a better standard, and it really went through with very minimal or really no damage in a lot of these cases. This is a air photo or a satellite photo after Hurricane Michael struck the Florida Panhandle as a Cat 5 hurricane in 2018. And you can see these new fortified roofs here have no damage. These brighter white roofs here survived Michael just fine, but we can see there's tremendous amount of damage in this photograph. So there is something to building better. And the concept is that if you build better, you can maybe spend slightly more money the first time, but then not have to do costly repairs and really have a lot of storm damage. Alabama's been really leading the way with this. There was a grant program called Strengthen Alabama Homes. You can find it on the Smart Home America website, and it says it's open to all residents regardless of income or insurer, provides grants up to $10,000 to homeowners. So these are grants provided to people in Alabama that give $10,000 for them to move towards having a fortified roof and to better prepare and build better to mitigate storm losses in the future. You can see, I believe there's over 14,000 fortified houses now. Over 12,000 of those are in Alabama, according to the IBHS website. So this is really taken off in Alabama. I think there's been a lot of the parts are connecting there. You can see, for example, grants to help people do this. And this would be great to see really all over the country, I think. So that's something that you can just look for fortified. You can look at Smart Home America, IBHS. You can learn a lot about this, but a better way to think of this is probably building my home beyond the elevation and building codes. May cost more money in the short term, but it will likely save me money, effort, and stress in the long term. And that's what they're really seeing, that these houses often are assessing higher. A storm like Sally comes in and all of a sudden, wow, fortified roofs did really well. And we're seeing that now in some of these storms in recent years, like Dorian and several years ago in Florida. I think it was 2019, and then Sally last year. Fortified roofs are doing really well, and fortified houses are having less damage than other houses. Number 6 and number 7, we're going to get into climate change. You know, for the first 13 years that I worked in climate science, I more or less stayed away from climate change, but for several reasons now I'm addressing it. I think it's an important topic, and I want to share 2 ways that climate change can blindside us. The first is really I'm going to look at people that are more entrenched, you know, both in the left and on the right politically. I'm going to look at both of them and some errors that we can see in our thinking. Thought number 6, climate change is responsible for all the hurricanes, floods, droughts, heat waves, cold snaps, etc. that we are having now. All natural disasters are tied to climate change. We need to do everything we can to stop it. So that is a perspective that some people have. This is from the Alliance for Climate Education. It says, Texas climate is changing, but we can stop it. It starts in your classroom. And it says, but we have the power to stop it. So it's really a worldview that, you know, we should not have disasters. We should not have a changing climate. We need to stop this as soon as we can. Some issues, some problems with that, for one, that we've seen tremendous changes in the Earth's climate through history. We, for example, have this map of the glacial extent of the glaciers in the last ice age. And, you know, really glaciers were pushing down well into the Midwest and the northeastern states. And we see evidence of this. One of my favorite states to visit is the state of Maine. It's just beautiful there. When you spend time driving around the state of Maine, you see a lot of signs that there was a lot of ice over this landscape before. There's something called glacial erratics, just these huge boulders just by itself in the middle of a field. Glaciers are actually rivers of ice. They're moving ice from the interior part of the continent towards moving south or moving towards the coast. And along the way, they pick up big rocks and boulders and they deposit them. You can see signs of that. Also, this is a photograph from coastal Maine where actually the moving ice with rocks embedded kind of made these grooves in the rocks there right along the coast there in Maine. You can see a lot of signs that at one point there was a tremendous amount of ice over the landscape there in Maine, but it's not there today. And it was not even there when, you know, this area became more populated even several hundred years ago. Pre-industrial revolution, there were not, you know, hundreds of feet of ice over the landscape in Maine. So there have been some big changes over time on the landscape. We see this also in the Gulf Coast and Southeast US. When we look back at the previous extent of the shoreline, it used to be well offshore. So there's a time where Florida's boundary really was the red dashed line. And we can see evidence now of forests that are, you know, submerged now in what is salt water. That, you know, the land used to take up a lot more space than it does now. And that has to do with previous ice ages when water was really stored up in the ice cap. And so sea levels were considerably lower. Sea levels have been rising for thousands of years. So this is something that naturally, we had a natural cycle that we were moving into. And so a more accurate way that we may think of this first thing I said is that climate change is a natural phenomenon. We can see dramatic changes in Earth's climate long before humans had an impact on it. Therefore, it can never be stopped and would be unnatural to do so. However, and there is a huge however, and we're going to get into the other side of the argument here, where a lot of people say, hey, climate change is a hoax because climate has always been changing. It's a political ideology introduced by the left. And so we're going to look at a few things that are happening with really a rapidly changing climate right now. One thing that we're going to look at that has a big impact are these rapidly intensifying hurricanes. Last year, Hurricane Laura exploded from a Category 1 to a Category 4 hurricane, making landfall with 150 miles an hour winds in southwest Louisiana. And I was there on the ground really before and just after, and the damage was tremendous. This is the southern part of Lake Charles, just really shredded by probably Cat 3 winds in that area. And this is really something that we're seeing a lot of now. 4 times in the past 4 years, we've had hurricanes rapidly intensify by at least 40 miles an hour in the 24 hours before landfall. We had Harvey in 2017, Michael in 2018, Laura and Hannah last year. This is 4 times in the past 4 years. To give you some context, it's only happened 9 times since 1950. When we look at the last 4 years, we see 4 of these. So we see 1 per year in the last 4 years. When we look at the first 50 years of this record, it only happened 3 times, or once every 17 years. So is this a trend related with climate change? If you're observant, you might say, hang on a second, Hal. Remember a couple slides back when you looked at South Carolina and there was just a cluster of 8 hurricanes in 11 years? Maybe that's what's happening here with rapidly intensifying hurricanes. Maybe this is just random. If that's your perspective, that is very observant, and that is a very good way to think and question. We can't just see, disasters out there, wildfires, hurricanes, and just immediately cherry pick that and call it a climate change event. We can't do that. We need to look deeper at the science behind that. We think what may be driving these rapidly intensifying hurricanes is warmer saltwater temperatures out there in the Gulf of Mexico. And so keep in mind, all 4 of these were in the Gulf Coast. I did this little analysis to kind of get an idea of how water temperatures might be changing in the Gulf. Unfortunately, we don't have, 150 years of water temperatures from the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. We do know that the waters are very warm and seem to be warming. But there's an interesting perspective that you can get here from my hometown of Galveston. We have the longest continuous weather records west of the Mississippi River. We have weather records here continuous for 150 years in my town of Galveston. And what's interesting about Galveston in the summertime, generally summer and early fall, the winds are consistently blowing from the south or the southeast. And so they're coming across long stretches of salt water before they hit our island. And so I was curious to know, do we see changes in the overnight temperature in Galveston? Why overnight? Because we're not dealing with sunshine. Like, today we have sun and clouds. If it's sunny, it's going to be hotter. If it's cloudy, it's going to be cooler. At night, you don't have the sun. And also at night, we tend to have less showers and thunderstorms. So I thought it's a more, pure way to look at this. And I ran this trend where I was curious to see how many hot nights have we had in Galveston over the past 150 years. Hot night defined as 84-degree minimum temperature, or 85 where you see orange, or 86 where you see red, or 87 where you see purple. And what you see here is we never had a hot night before 1927. And then we started seeing, a few of them show up around the middle of the 20th century. But look at the past couple decades. We've seen an explosion in the amount of hot nights. We see a lot of orange showing up here in the 90s through the 2000s. And then in the last 2 years, we see our first nights where we have overnight low temperatures of 86 and 87. I think really, I'm comparing this with inland locations, but I think it's very likely that a big part of this is warmer Gulf waters offshore, which is a big concern because warm water temperatures are how hurricanes get their fuel. And so rapidly intensifying hurricanes really may be this legit thing that we need to be really concerned about moving forward. Another issue coming up with climate change are stalled out storms. The whole reason we have storms is the difference in temperature and energy between the tropics and the poles. We have a lot more energy in the tropics than we do in the poles, and the movement of that energy and temperature is what drives our weather. We know that the models are predicting and our observations are showing that the Arctic, the poles, are warming faster than the tropics. It's reducing that difference or that gradient in the temperature over space. And so theoretically, this should probably slow down some of our circulation and slow down some of our storms. And that seems to be what we're seeing. 6 times in the past 6 years, we've seen a stalled out tropical system or hybrid system coming in the US and causing tremendous flooding in the summertime. In 2015, it was South Carolina. 2016, it was a hybrid storm in South Louisiana that dumped more than 30 inches of rain in places like Baton Rouge. 2017, Hurricane Harvey, I took this picture right here in Galveston. Parts of Southeast Texas got more than 50 or 60 inches of rain, setting records. Hurricane Florence, this is a picture I took in the Carolinas in 2018, stalled out for a couple days, more than 30 inches of rain in North Carolina. Tropical Storm Imelda in Southeast Texas in 2019 just stalled out for a couple days. And then last year, Hurricane Sally came into South Alabama. I took this picture in Dauphin Island. The forward motion at the time of landfall was only 2 miles an hour. I consider that more or less a stalled out tropical system. The average speed historically for tropical systems would be around 12 miles an hour. As far as the forward motion of a hurricane, Sally came in only moving at 2 miles an hour. Again, another signature of one of these stalled out systems. This creates all kinds of problems, the foremost being the hurricane stays around for a long time and dumps a tremendous amount of rainfall. You can, if you want to learn more about this, you can just do a web search for how a warming world may have caused Hurricane Florence to stall. That's a piece I did with PBS NewsHour, but this seems like there's legitimate science attached to it. The final one I'm going to talk about is sea level rise. We see the pictures here from places like Muir Glacier in Alaska of a lot of ice in 1941 and a lot less ice in 2004. We see sunny day flooding. This is saltwater flooding on Galveston Island that I took. This is becoming more and more common here, that we see saltwater flooding from the land sinking and sea levels rising at the same time. We're starting to see a lot of that. And when we talk about sea level rise, keep in mind, in a lot of our coastal locations, we have 80, 90, 100 or more years of data. Here in Galveston, I plotted out, or this is just available actually through NOAA Tides and Currents. This is the mean sea level from 1950s to present, or to 2010. Basically 50 years of sea level data for Galveston. And we can see we're observing very, rapidly rising water levels here. This isn't just something theoretical. It's something that we're observing in the tide gauge record. And so why is that a big issue? Well, this is a high water mark here on this step from Hurricane Ike that struck Galveston 13 years ago. Our rate of relative sea level rise here, you can look at the bottom here, 2.17 feet per every 100 years. That's more than 3 inches every 12 years. This storm hit 13 years ago. So if we saw a carbon copy of Ike come to Galveston this year, I would predict this house, instead of being dry by a couple inches, would actually have water over the floorboards. Why? The difference really because of relative sea level rise. The sea levels rising relative to the land. So this becomes a big deal, and it's something that can really impact our communities as well. You can actually go to NOAA Tides and Currents, and you can see the rate of sea level rise for your coastal location. A lot of people are shocked to find out that it's very variable, depending where you are. Places like South Louisiana, they're observing more than 3 feet per century. Here in the upper Texas coast where I live, more than 2 feet per century. A lot of the Gulf Coast really between 1 and 2, where you see the yellow arrows, and then areas in green are less than 1 foot per century. But depending where you are, there's a different amount of sea level rise. That's mostly due to something called land subsidence or land sinking. So when we talk about sea levels rising, they are rising globally, but also in some areas, the ground is sinking faster than others. And so the rates of sea level rise change depending where you're at. So perhaps a more accurate way to think about this climate change issue is, although every storm is not caused by climate change, the climate is warming and will likely have numerous impacts, including rapidly intensifying and stalled out tropical cyclones, as well as rapidly intensifying and stalled out tropical cyclones, as well as rising sea levels. The collective impact of this could be tremendous. I wanted to close the presentation today by talking about the big picture of this presentation. It's the Do Not Get Blindsided buffet. We've talked about 7 ways that people get blindsided. The reason that we're talking about this topic is to provide an accurate scientific perspective that leads to actionable knowledge, and that we can take action to minimize loss of life and property. Okay, so when we talk there about climate change, that was not to arm people with facts that they can use at Thanksgiving dinner to argue with their uncle and convince them about their side of the story, right? That's not what this is about. It's not about being contentious or arguing with people. It is about actually looking realistically at what's happening in the world and trying to align our perspectives with reality as much as we can. I work with coastal communities all the time. And what I see, for example, with hurricanes, a lot of times coastal cities or say hospitals will have emergency response plans that assume this is what we do when the hurricane's 72 hours before landfall. This is what we do at 48 hours before landfall. This is what we do at 24 hours before landfall. And they're making an assumption that they may not have the luxury of having 48 hours notice or 72 hours notice. When we talk about rapidly intensifying hurricanes, the reason we're sharing that information and saying, wow, this really seems to jive with these warmer water temperatures. There really may be a climate change signature there. The reason we're saying that is I would love to talk to someone in 10 years who says, thank you for talking about climate change. When we heard your presentation, we went back to our hospital and we said, hey, we need to make some contingencies for a case where we do not have the luxury of a 48-hour notice. What happens if a storm blows up in 36 hours or 24 hours and all of a sudden we have a hurricane moving in where we only had 30 hours notice? We might have to change the way we think about risk and plan and prepare so we can take action, so we can minimize our losses, right? That's what this is all about. So I realize the climate change stuff does get a little bit contentious, but I think it's really important. It's something I definitely want to talk to my kids about. I think sometimes people's perception and approach to this tells you a lot of their worldview, right? Are they really entrenched on the left or on the right politically, or are they willing to be open-minded, really stay close to the science, consider all options, and really consider the facts? And that's what we have to do. It's a topic I've been talking more about. But again, we covered a lot of things today, not just climate change. We talked about having the contents of your house covered. We talked about the randomness in these hurricanes, how we see clusters, or just because you've lived in a house for 30 years and it hasn't flooded doesn't mean it can't flood, especially when we look at these histories and we can learn from them and use them to be better prepared moving into the future. Everyone, I love the engagement. I've been on social media quite a bit, doing Facebook Lives and other engagement with on the CNC social media. I love hearing from you on what your questions are, on what your thoughts are. And a lot of the the people that follow CNC on social media are flood adjusters or other professionals that are out there on the ground before the storm, in the storm, after the storm. I'd love any interactions with you to know, what are you seeing in the field? What would you love to be talked about on a future Flood News at Noon, or just, in general education, or also if there's a hurricane approaching, what are your information needs? I'd love to hear about that. Shoot me an email, send me a text or call, or, let's interact on social media. That's everything I have today from a perspective on floods from the Don't Get Blindsided buffet. My hope is that hopefully somewhere there was a nugget of truth here that maybe you can use in your own life or share with someone else. And the whole idea here is that we're not blindsided. Just like in the opening story, now if I need to go to Houston on a Sunday evening, I don't give myself 45 minutes. I give myself a lot longer than that because I learned that there's a pattern and I don't want to get blindsided by that. So that's everything from me. I'd love to hear if we have any questions. Thank you so much for your attention, everyone. It was so great to be here with you today on Flood News at Noon.
Thanks, Hal. Greatly appreciate it. We have one of those playground traffics here in Mobile. Everybody from Texas and Louisiana like to go to Orange Beach, Alabama. And they like to basically go about 4 miles an hour in our tunnel. So it just causes massive traffic jam. So if you don't leave at a certain time, you have 3 or 4 hours, which normally would take an hour to get to where we're supposed to be going. So we got one of those here. So I believe we do have a couple questions. Julie?
Yes. The first one, they say they really enjoyed your presentations. And they're curious, what are you most excited for during the hurricane season?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. What am I most excited for? You know what? Last year it was so cool. There were some different hurricanes and flood events coming in. For example, there was one called Tropical Storm Beta coming into Texas. And we got a lot of community interaction where we had citizen scientists say, hey, you can install a flood meter on my house. So we could actually measure the flooding in the urban landscape. We had citizen scientists say, you can install a flood meter and we would love to take pictures of the flood levels through the storm. That level of community engagement was really cool last year. And so I really like interacting with people. It's always a double-edged sword. We don't want to see damage and destruction on people's lives, but these storms are inevitable. So when they do come, I love interacting with people on the community level, hearing from them in the field, but also interacting with them during the storm to document what's happening and to forecast it. That's really kind of fun having those interactions.
Thank you. The other one was more of a comment. They would like to see one of the charts for the Mobile Bay area. Is there any way to get that?
Yeah, Mobile is one of the cities that we've been leading up with on the USurge project. And I think we're mostly complete with that. I don't think it's 100% complete, but we're very close. And so, yeah, that would be great. Mobile actually, I think, has some early flood records, possibly, I think, from the 1700s. I think Mobile is a very old city, and there's some really interesting flood records there from the Bay. So that's something that we're working on, and when it's available, it's something that we'd love to interact and show people.
Cool.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions in the box. Okay. Thank you again, Hal, and I'm going to turn it over to Craig.
I actually have a few questions as well. So one of the charts that you showed was regarding the sea level trends, the different levels that happen over a century. So just curious if there's any data out there. What areas do you see where sea level rise will become a factor in consistent flooding? And I know some of those areas like Miami only had like a foot over a century, but are those areas also subject to potential, even with just a foot? Is there areas where you see potentially will become an issue as the sea levels continues to rise?
Craig, that's such a great question. That graphic of the sea level trends, that was based on the past 100 years. That was not really projections into the future. Unfortunately, most of the projections do show accelerated sea level rise. You brought up the question of specific areas that we should be concerned about. Really, two types of areas concern me. One are the areas where we have ground that's also sinking or subsiding quickly. South Louisiana probably leads the continent in that. I mean, it's sinking really quickly, but also the upper Texas coast. There's a reason why we see faster rates of sea level rise in places like Galveston and Beaumont than other places in the country. So those areas that are sinking quickly really concern me. But other areas that concern me are areas like South Florida, where the landscape, the ground is very porous. South Florida has a lot of limestone, and it's very porous. It allows salt water to kind of push through the soil. And so even just maybe a foot of sea level rise or 2 feet in a place like Miami, you can build a seawall in Miami, but the water often will come under that seawall. So that's another issue to also consider geologically. Areas that have porous limestone, when you drive around Miami, you'll see someone has a stone wall. Look at the stones in that wall. There are all kinds of holes in the stones. That shows, they're not importing those stones from 1,000 miles away. Usually a wall is taking local stones. And you see all these holes in those stones. If you see a stone wall in the city of Miami, that just shows you underground there's a lot of open space, and it can really let the salt water move in. So they're seeing a lot of sunny day flooding in South Florida as well. And we see a lot of people building really low, close to the beach in a lot of our areas, like in Florida as well.
Very interesting. Okay. We just had another one pop into the chat box here. So we have basically 2 more. You may be able to answer this one. We'll throw it out there. What changes to flood insurance will evolve because of these new changes?
Yeah, that is a question. I mean, you may have heard of FEMA's Risk Rate 2.0. It looks like there's being a reassessment of how insurance is going to be done. That's, I know it's coming. I know people are very concerned about it. It looks like we may see some drastic increases of insurance in some areas. It's not my area of specialty. I'm aware of it, and I know coastal communities are concerned about it. It's something I know a lot of us at CNC have been talking about, and several of our friends, in the insurance industry can provide insights on that. If someone has a specific question for me about that, I do know some people that have a lot of expertise with those detailed questions. If they want to contact me or someone else, I can direct them to people that really are on top of those details. But it's a great question. I love the applied nature of that question, because we don't want to just talk about this stuff just to talk about facts. That's a very applied question and a very important question.
All right, final question. So where will the first hurricane hit this year? What will be the forward speed? What will be the top winds? And what will be the number of flood claims that come from it?
It's going to be August 19th at 4:30 p.m. And Craig, it's going to be just like a direct line south of your house, actually. And okay. I said 4:30 p.m. I meant 4:30 Eastern, so it'll be 3:30 Central.
3:30 Central. Okay.
Yeah. We have a time zone thing going on. There are some forecasters that do try to pinpoint stuff quite like that. It reminds me though, we are expecting an active season this year, in part because we're seeing warmer than normal water temperatures in the Gulf, Caribbean, and Atlantic, and then the equatorial Pacific. That kind of affects the conditions in the Atlantic. And it looks like conditions are set up for probably a more active than normal year. Probably not as hyperactive as last year, but we are looking at a more active season. And there's an index that gives us an idea of where these may track, called the North Atlantic Oscillation. And that index seems to be shifted a little bit towards the west. So I would expect to see some impacts for sure in the Caribbean and US this year. I don't think this is going to be one of those years where all the storms stay way out to sea. I think if anything, the storms maybe shifted a little bit farther west, which would give them more impact. So I think that's the best that we can do right now. But the heart of hurricane season, really, early August through late September, and we're moving into it quickly. So it's something to stay tuned to the National Hurricane Center. I'll keep the CNC social media updated very frequently. I've been doing 2 Facebook Lives per week. And as an active storm gets out there, I'll be providing a lot of guidance and a lot of our own information and maps and risk assessment that we create in-house.
Fantastic. I do have one comment, and it's not really a question, just kind of a thought. And it's sort of a question. But why does it seem that most of the hurricanes, when they make landfall during the evening hours or early morning hours, basically when the sun's down? Is that a pattern? Is that like flipping the coin, where you could have heads, tails? I mean, it always seems to me that they always hit during the night.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And, I haven't actually climatologically broken that down. I'm just thinking of the hurricanes I've gone into. I think it may be a perception thing, is just my gut feeling, because there's something, if you've ever been in a hurricane and you're hearing all these things, and it's kind of creepy. If you have daylight, there at least you can kind of look around.
Yeah.
There's something about hurricane winds at night that it's just creepier, or it seems so much worse. You're hearing stuff and you don't know what's happening. You just can't really see. And often the power's going out too. So, you know, it's not night the way usually if you walk out onto your street at night, you have street lights, and, you know, in a hurricane, it can be pitch black. And so you're just hearing stuff's going on. You don't know what just crashed. I think it might be a perception thing that those videos we see or those memories we have of the night hurricanes are so much more terrifying.
Yeah.
That's just my gut feeling.
Makes sense. Okay. Well, I think that's it for the chat box. I think everybody had their questions answered. So, yeah, somebody just asked for your information again. We just put that in the chat box. Again, Hal, thanks a lot for participating again. Great to have you on. Just a reminder to everybody on the call, we have our final episode coming up in 2 weeks with Dr. Croissant. Pronounce that right. I think she's French, right? So
Yeah, you got it right.
So I know Hal, Hal introduced us to her. He's worked with her, so I'm excited to have her on as our last presenter for the 2021 season 2 Flood News at Noon. And just a quick reminder, as you sign in, make sure you sign in properly for each episode. One, you get your CNC points, but also we're doing our giveaways at the end. And on our last episode, right after Dr. Croissant does her presentation, we'll be giving away some good CNC swag and goodies and all that good stuff there for our final episode of the season 2. So again, Hal, great to have you on. Appreciate your time. And everybody, we'll see everybody again in 2 weeks. Y'all have a wonderful 2 weeks. Thanks, everybody.